Growing up in a Christian home, I had the wonderful privilege of experiencing the joy of Easter each year as a very young child. We were in the Northern Hemisphere, so Easter coincides with springtime. And I can remember new clothes. I can remember tulips bursting through the snow. I can remember a sense of excitement as we'd gather as a church. The choir would sing like they didn't sing at any other time of the year. And all of the adults in the church just seemed to have a buzz about them. It was a time of great joy. And I can remember as a kid not really understanding why, but thinking it was fantastic to be a part of something like that. As I grew up in that wonderful church, I had the privilege of being in a healthy and evangelistically effective church where there was a newness in the faith experience and people coming to Jesus on a regular basis. I had the privilege of being discipled by an older Christian who showed me a verse in the Bible, and I remember having the first opportunity to draw a line between Easter conviction and Easter celebration. He showed me a verse in Romans chapter 10, verse 9, which says, "If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." I remember studying that verse in my teens and beginning to think about the significance of a conviction that Jesus is alive and the celebration of that life in our discipleship, in our worship, in our experience together. And that verse has continued to inspire me and to bless me, and I want to talk about that verse with you this morning. You will be saved, the verse says. So let's start there. What does it mean to be saved? In some religious traditions, that word has been painted very narrowly. It's been painted with just a few colors to suggest that it has something to do with our far future and our distant salvation. It has something to do with heaven, but little to do with earth. It has something to do with eternity, but little to do with now. And that way of posturing around that concept is not biblical at all. In the Bible, the word saved is used repeatedly in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, to describe a very wide and wonderful and exciting space of God's activity. It has to do with health. That word is used when people are in physical crisis, when people are in distress. You will be saved. It has to do with political contexts and wars and a crisis that grips a whole population of people. It has to do with being in exile, being refugees, being in slavery. You will be saved. It has to do with political and economic and business crisis and success and issues of everyday life in all of the ordinary press of how we live. And in the midst of things that are so troubling and so challenging, you will be saved. It's a word that is best thought of not just in a narrow religious context, but in political contexts, in health contexts, in business contexts, in everyday life contexts. And it's a word in the Old Testament that has to do with wholeness and with blessing. It has to do with well-being and expansiveness. It has to do with being resourced to the point that there's an abundance and you can share and you can be a blessing to others. It's a word that speaks of the longevity, not just of life in this world, but of God's eternal purposes and plans. And so to be saved is to be positioned in such a way that your life is rich, you have a deep and wonderful sense of security, and that you are looking way beyond the end of your own days into the purposes of God that stretch into eternity, and there's a place for you in it all. You will be saved. This wonderful verse that connects Easter conviction with Easter celebration. Believe that God has raised Jesus from the dead in your heart, and you will be saved. Let's take just a moment and hear the amazing Easter story as recorded by Luke in his gospel in chapter 24.
On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices that they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the 3rd day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the others with them, who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to be like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying beside themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened.
So, what does it mean to believe in your heart? We hear the Easter story in the first 12 verses of Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, and we find the women having had an amazing experience, which they give witness of to the disciples, who weigh it up as nonsense. And then Peter runs and has a look for himself, and he leaves the scene of Jesus' empty tomb, wondering. I love the authenticity, the genuineness of the gospel record. We don't encounter a group of followers of Jesus who are quick to embrace this story. Quite frankly, they're slow to embrace it. Quite frankly, their intellect gets in the way, their emotions get in the way, they're processing all of this and thinking, this is crazy. And there is this resistance before there is conviction. But as we continue to read in the Gospels, as we continue to stand in the midst of those stories, as Jesus appears, as various people hear this witness and respond, as others who did not see Jesus in his resurrection body in the room, but heard the stories and experienced the presence of Jesus in their lives, also make these commitments, we see an amazing group of people move from thinking that it's nonsense to being witnesses and martyrs for this truth. And we see a whole group of people, the apostles themselves, and Peter especially, who was there and wondering at the beginning, and the 11 who were thinking it was nonsense, and then Paul, and the women who witnessed the resurrection, and others who were church planters like Phoebe and Junica, James, and later Titus and Timothy, and the numbers just keep growing. These individuals who moved from thinking that this is just a wonder to be reflected on to worshiping and responding with their whole hearts. So what is this conviction? What is this? What does it mean to believe in your heart that God has raised Jesus from the dead and so to be saved? Well, I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that you can stay in Luke chapter 24, verses 11 and 12, and just kind of gather this up in some kind of, I'm not sure what it means, but I'll just carry on sort of way. You cannot stay in the space of this is nonsense. I wonder what it means. I'll just take it and tuck it into my heart someplace with the unicorns and the fairies, and I'll carry on with life. I mean, I don't know what it means. It's just too crazy, but I'll say I believe and I'll keep going. That kind of posture brings no power to life's experience, and it brings no confidence to faith, and it brings no change to behavior. What's needed is something very different. What Paul was envisioning was something very different, and I'm confident that it was different because of the whole verse in Romans chapter 10, verse 9. He says, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. It's that first phrase. If you confess Jesus is Lord, that is setting people up in the first century in Rome. This letter was written to Rome, the center of the empire. It's setting people up for a very confronting conversation, engagement, life experience with their friends. You see, the word Lord in the first century was a dangerous word. It held great significance and great power, because it was a word used by the religious leaders to sort of substitute for God. In the Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, the word Lord is used in place of the sacred name for God, Yahweh. And so to say Jesus is Lord is to make an astonishing claim about who Jesus is as God. And then for the Romans, the word Lord was used to describe the power of the Caesar. This was the word that spoke to the concentrated power in the nation. And so there was a declaration that Caesar is Lord. For a Christian to be overt and public in their testimony and to say, Jesus is Lord. He's the one that I'm mentoring my life to. I'm an understudy of Jesus because I believe he is God and the political power in this world, was to make one incredible statement. And if all you have to say after that is, may the unicorns and the fairies help us, you're in a very difficult place. I'm confident that Paul had this sense that the conviction of the resurrection of Jesus Christ would make a phenomenal difference. There's power in this belief. There is security in this belief. There's confidence. If you can go here in your spirit, you will find a whole new way of being alive in this world and living purposefully and hopefully into all the challenges that you will face. Confess with your mouth, says Paul. Declare it. Jesus is Lord. And then believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, and you will be positioned in a way that your life is whole, your life is secure, your life is blessed and abundant. You will be saved. So what does it mean to believe in the resurrection of Jesus in our hearts? Here at New Hope, we've been exploring this whole theme of a new heart. And we have been recognizing that the way we think about the human person is really very important. What is human nature? And sometimes we just have a kind of muddled view. We've been reflecting together on this theme, and the writings of Dallas Willard have been a great help to us. He identifies, as he does a lot of biblical study across the whole of the Bible and pushes into ancient thinking about human nature, that the heart or the human spirit or the will of a person is that central piece that defines us as individual persons and drives all the activity, all the decisions, all the feelings of our lives. It's actually deeper than our thoughts. It is more primary than our emotions. Think of your heart as the most central part of who you are. Think of your heart as that part of you which is not just material, not just biology and chemistry, but is actually the breath of God into the clay in that original creation story. It's the part of you that is most able to connect with God and most truly defining of your individuality, of your independence, of your authority as a person. That place, which is deeper than intellect and deeper than emotion. It is much more than just your physical body and your social connections. It's in that place that Paul says this conviction should take hold. When you believe in your heart, when you have in the inner recesses of your life a settled conviction that God is at work in this crazy, broken world, doing the unthinkable and the unexpected, it will affect your whole life. So what often happens is we get stuck at the level of intellect and emotion. We get stuck trying to work out an intellectual argument. How could this be? Or we get stuck at the level of our emotions and what we feel about all of this. And Paul is inviting us to go deeper. Let the Spirit of the living God bear witness with your human spirit. Pursue this issue. Seek God's power. Seek the living presence of Jesus Christ. Ask God to show you that he is alive, and to show you that he is alive in you and for you and in the community where you would seek to follow him together. This is what enlivened the early church. And this is what propelled Paul in his preaching and what caused him to connect Easter conviction with Easter celebration and call his community to something very exciting. You see, once this conviction is anchored in your heart, once your heart, your human spirit, your inner will is informed by this notion that Jesus is not in his grave, he is alive in the world, it changes everything. This means that evil is not so powerful as we thought it was. Evil is not a power equal to God. Somebody in something I was reading just this week gave me a very helpful thought. C.S. Lewis, he was asked, do you believe in the devil? He said, if you're asking me, do I believe in a power that is equal to but opposite from God? No, I don't. But do I believe in a personal, powerful, evil force in the world? Absolutely. His name is Satan, the accuser, the devil. But you need to think of him as the archangel Michael's opposite. He's not all-powerful and opposite to God. He is powerful like a mighty and beautiful angel opposite to the archangel Michael. There's evil in the world and it's not so powerful as we might have thought. It's not so powerful as we might have conceded to. It's a power that can be crushed. It's a power that can be conquered. This is what the resurrection of Jesus demonstrates and what we commit ourselves to. Evil is not so powerful as we thought, nor is death so final as we might have imagined. For here in the resurrection of Jesus is evidence of a doorway through the grave into the eternal hope of God. Factor that into the worries of your week and everything changes. Factor that truth into the concerns and decisions that you're making. Should I take this risk, which is good and true, and I know God wants me to, but it might have consequences? Well, if I can factor in the weakness of evil, and I can factor in the temporality of death and the possibility of eternal hope, it changes everything. Paul says, anchor these convictions in your heart. Let this conviction affect your intellect and your emotion. Let the knowledge that God raised Jesus up from the dead drive the way you make your choices, the attitude that you bring to issues, the way you think about life. And do you know what will happen? As you declare Jesus is Lord and allow him to be the model and you become his understudy, and you recognize his resurrection in the midst of this world, you'll be saved. You will live a life that has a greater wholeness, no matter what's coming at you. You'll live a life that is anticipating eternity. You'll live a life that is right and righteous in the presence of God because of the marvelous way in which the story of Jesus impacts your story and draws you into the fullness of God. Paul's vision is huge and it is beautiful, and it is the reason those folks were gathering every Sunday when I was a kid and singing and celebrating and all that joy in the Easter celebrations. I have pushed into this story now as an adult and reflecting again on the connection between an Easter conviction and an Easter celebration, and it brings me to an even greater sense of joy and passion for this Easter season. We're in isolation. We're in the midst of a pandemic. There are so many things that could challenge us, but I know what will save us. I know what will save us. It is a declaration of the Lordship of Jesus Christ and a conviction held in our hearts that God has raised him up from the dead. The presence of Jesus in our lives, God hides it in plain view. So we're playing a game this morning. It's Easter. There are Easter eggs hidden in this scene and throughout our Easter presentation this morning, and I hope the kids are looking for them and counting them. Do you realize that Jesus hides himself in plain view? And we are asked to open our spirits, to open our hearts, and to see his presence, and let that conviction drive our choices and our living, and everything changes. Hallelujah. Jesus is risen.